Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about 3D inside of After Effects. Okay, the first thing we have to know is that After Effects is not a 3D software. It has some capabilities, and in the new version of After Effects, you are able to do a little bit more with 3D, but you are still very limited. However, just because After Effects is slightly limited when it comes to 3D, it doesn't really mean that you can't make amazing things. And so its capabilities extend even a lot more when you incorporate third party plugins. Alright, so first thing that we have to talk about is the new version of After Effects and how it works with 3D. And let's do a quick demo. We'll create a new project, and now that we have a project with After Effects, the first thing that we have to do is a composition. I'll make a new composition. I'll call it 3D, 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, and we'll make this a 10-second composition. Alright, so the first thing that we need to know is that After Effects only accepts a GBL format, but that is not a very popular type of format. So, however, it's available on other softwares owned by Adobe, like Substance. So Substance will export that type of file. And there is a library where you can go and search for files. But I'm assuming that if you're working with something in 3D, you are expecting to incorporate some type of your own object that you want to work with. And the easiest way to work around that is to use something like Blender, that if you get a file with something like an OBJ, which is a very popular type of 3D file, you import it into Blender and export it as a GBL. And then once you have that, you can bring it into After Effects. So that's the easiest way to work around that in order to be able to bring something into After Effects. Okay, so I'm going to bring in a GBL file that I made from a 3D model that I had. And this model, it imports in a scale relative to however it is created. In this particular case, this model is really big. So once I import a file, I will be able to have these transform values. And this particular model was made pretty big in the software. So if I bring the scale to something like 10%, that's still a lot. So 1%, that's a little better. Okay, so then there is the gizmo that allows us to move, rotate, and 3D space. And it works even sort of in a 2D world where we can manipulate it. You don't have to necessarily use the gizmo, but it is there. Okay, so now that the file is in there, we can see that it has texture, it has color, and this color exists already inside the GBL file, and it came with the file that was exported. The beauty of the GBL format is that it allows you to bake certain values to a model, for example, texture. And so when you export something, you are able to export it with the textures that you are using, unlike other formats that you have to use the textures as a separate file. So that is a good thing about the GBL format. Alright, so now that we have a file inside of After Effects, we have to know that there's two very important things when it comes to 3D or working in 3D. One is the shader, and the other one is basically the renderer. The shader is the type of material. So if you want to make something look like it's made out of gold, or if you want to make it look like it's made out of, let's say, clay, those are called materials or shaders. And the renderer is what allows you to get that final image based on the textures or the values that the model has. So the renderer has to do with the lights, the shadows that create the image, and the textures are what make the values for those renders. And so there's two different formats. A shader can work different in different softwares, and the renderer works different in all these other softwares. And when it comes to rendering, the model is currently being rendered, and the renderers in After Effects, there is a new one called Advanced Renderer. If we go to Classic 3D, it won't read it. And there's the Cinema 4D option, but you have to install Cinema 4D. If you're working with Cinema 4D, there's probably no reason to be working on the GBL format. But there is some type of render properties. So at this point, all we're getting is the basic information from the model, but now the type of renderer inside of After Effects works only with one light. So if we go to the layers, new light, and we can see that Control-Alt-Shift-L is the shortcut for this. There's 5 different lights. Before, there was only 4. The new light that exists is this environment. Before, we only had parallel, spot, point, and ambient. So the environment light is something new that works for the 3D objects. So if I create new, you can see that right away that the way the model is being rendered looked different. So if I turn off the lights, you can see that it works different as well. It looks completely different. Okay, so now that the model is the inside, just by left clicking, we can move it around. But in order to actually navigate around the 3D space, we need a camera. And then we can use the rotation tools or the transform tools of the camera even without having a camera, and we'll automatically move in 3D space. And if I just press C on my keyboard, it will change from those tools, which is the rotation, the pan, and the dolly. Okay, so I'm left clicking, and if I want to move it, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to position it like that for now. And if I turn on the light, some of these areas get darker because now there is an environment light. So when an environment light gets added, there is the transform values that we can switch, and if we change this around, the way that it reflects the light on the 3D model will be changing based on the rotations from the transform values. And then other than that, we have the light options, and then there's only very few that we can change: the source, intensity, and the shadow darkness. If I make the shadows a lot darker, it doesn't really change much. If I turn off the cast shadows, the image changes, or the outcome changes. If I make it more intense, the reflection will be like that. Okay, so when it comes to rendering in any renderer, the way it works is it throws lights from one point to another. Either you create a light or you send light-like information based off an image. So that's a lot of times called an HDRI or an environment map. There's a couple different names, but it's basically an image that makes a circle that makes a world in 3D. And so the problem about the renderer currently in After Effects is that it only accepts actual HDRI images. So other renderers are able to use most images like a JPEG and use the values from those images to send the information to the environment and create lights based off of that. So in this particular case, I already grabbed an HDRI image, and then I'm going to import it. And as you can see, it looks a bit weird, but that's how these images are. I'm going to move it all the way down, and then I'm going to turn it off. The environment light, now from the source, I can change it from the default to the studio, and now that look changes. And if I change the transform on this, it looks now different. Okay, so now there is another map in here. This one is slightly different. And so the outcome of each image will give us different looks. So this is a little bit of darker situation that is going on. Okay, so those are the values that we can change in the new method of After Effects and the way it works in its own 3D world. Now that there is one item in 3D world, if I bring a second model, which is also a GBL file, let's scale this down, I'll hit OK. Now there's two different 3D assets that exist in the same world, and as you can see, they collide. They intersect, and so they exist in the same world. Okay, and now that we're talking about the same 3D world, we should talk about how After Effects works in this particular workflow. So the new method of After Effects allows you to incorporate many different objects into the same world, and then they will interact with each other. But let's set up a few examples. In this composition, I brought in a couple of different items. There is two solid layers that I converted into 3D layers. Okay, it's a 2D layer with solid color that was made 3D layer. And then inside the 3D layer, the material options were changed to, let's see, which one did I change? No. Shininess, yeah. If you add shininess to something, it will make sort of like a mirror or give it shine, basically. And then there's another 2D layer that does not have shine. So when we create any type of layer, if I go to layer, new, solid, and this one, let's make it a little white, then we'll hit OK. We have a 2D layer, and if I convert it to 3D with this little button right here that has this cube icon, we should be able to transform any layer into a 3D layer. So I'm going to bring in the scale a little bit, and so it becomes a 3D layer. And it has new properties. As you can see, that allows us to manipulate in different things. Those geometry options are not very helpful. Those geometry options at this point are not very visible, but we can work with the shininess again for something like this, and then it creates a mirror type of effect. If we bring this down and remove the metal and bring up the specular intensity and so on, as you can see, If we remove the diffuse, then it has no color and it becomes something more like gold, chrome type of situation. Okay, so I'll turn off this layer for now. I want to show in this particular example is that although we have a 3D world, I'm gonna select my transform tools, camera transform tools, to move around this 3D space or 3D world. And what I want to make it important, or what I want to note here is that some of these materials are very reflective. So like this layer that I made down here reflects, right? It's very reflective and it's reflecting the environment map that we made with this environment light. If I turn off that environment light, all those 3D values that have been applied don't know what to do because there's no light coming through. But once I turn those on, the values on those particular things change. But for example, this cube, which is a GBL file, I have no way of changing any of those parameters to make it more shiny or to just try to change some of the materials. I'm pretty limited there. I would have to go to the software again and then change them there and then export it with the right materials and then so on. So again, another limitation right there. Okay, but particularly in this render, there is no reflections on the interacting between the models or assets that exist in the 3D world. So this layer down here should be reflecting that model up there, but that is not the case. And so, as you can see, that right there, it's limiting the outcome of what we can actually do. So, of course, this is just a very new way of working inside of After Effects with 3D. So this is probably going to be fixed, hopefully soon. And not that you are not able to do a lot of things, you still can do a bunch of things, but it would be better to have all those possibilities which increase the outcome of what you can do. Okay. Now I'm going to open a older version of After Effects that has third-party plugins that also allow us to work in 3D, and we're going to compare those spaces and how they work. So in this first example, the world that I made was very similar to what was made in the other example, in the first example, and it's basically the exact same model with trying to mimic what was done in the first one. And so if I start to go around in this 3D world, this 3D world is in fact interacting with each other. So the difference is that in this third-party plugin, there is one world that exists in this 2D layer. So if I make this a 3D object, everything disappears. And now we have this very, very weird situation where we can see the world because it exists in that layer. But that layer exists in a different world, which is the After Effects world. And if we flip this thing around, there's nothing left. But if I remove the 3D option from the 2D layer, this becomes a 2D layer that has a 3D world inside. But the important thing is that this particular 3D world does have its own reflections and shadows and whatnot. Okay? So having shadows and having reflections is pretty cool and pretty good when you're working with 3D. It allows you to pretty much sell your shot a little better. Also, because this is a third-party plugin, this particular plugin allows you to change and manipulate any of these materials. So for example, once I open the plugin, there is a scene already in here, and there's already even materials that exist in here. So if I just drop something new to one of these materials, now it looks completely different. But the ability to change that material with just a couple of clicks is essential to working fast and getting the outcome that you want. Okay, let's check another example. Okay, so in this final example, there is 3 different 3D plugins in 3 different layers. So the first plugin is this making sort of bubbles going out. It's called Part Particular. And then there is a 3D layer, solid 3D layer. Then we have another third-party plugin making some waves. And then we finally have a plugin making a 3D world. So inside this camera, no matter where I look, it's making a 3D world. From this same HDRI map. Okay, so there is this 3D world that exists, and then there's another 3D world that is making this type of wave, and so it's obvious that this type of this wave looking thing exists inside the room or this sphere that is made in this 3D space. And so now there is another layer, but even though these look like they kind of are in the same space, or basically they are in the same space, depending on how they're rendered, they don't interact with each other. And the same goes with this third-party plugin that is also working in 3D. It's not interacting with the other environments. Now, some of these plugins do allow you to interact with certain layers, but interacting with worlds that exist in 2D layers, it's basically impossible. It's pretty much impossible. Now, there's ways to make anything you want here, but interacting between those worlds, because they're made inside 2D layers, is virtually impossible. So basically, we're very limited inside of After Effects, but again, there's a lot of people that make amazing things. 3D is a subject that has so much information outside of After Effects, but in my perspective, After Effects makes it look easy. I think that I was able to learn 3D because I started using After Effects, and it allowed me to have a sort of a better understanding of how it worked, and kind of allowed me to start using it from the get-go, because there was a lot of 3D softwares that were pretty complicated to just learn the software. And for me, the whole idea of seeing something right in the footage that I was shooting was just pretty cool. And when you're working on 3D software, you're probably going to have to render that and then incorporate it with the video itself. So I started learning video first, and therefore, if I could bring the 3D into the video world, which is what After Effects does, it's a much simpler way to learn it. And also, because I was learning in that way, I kind of was staying away from 3D software, and I was trying to make everything I could inside of After Effects. So as you can see, After Effects is still pretty limited, but that's not stopping artists from making a lot of amazing things. Once you understand how the 3D worlds work inside of After Effects, you're going to be able to build your own worlds with ease. Okay, so those are the very basics of 3D and 3D worlds inside of After Effects. I hope you learned something from it and it helps you in your journey. I'll see you in the next one.